Hi, and welcome to another Pi Crowdcast. I'm Rick Tarosi, the co-founder and general manager of Pi. I'll be here today. Today, we're speaking with founder Elia Freedman. Elia,
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
thanks so much for making time to hang out with us today. Before we get started with Elia, just some logistics for folks. If this is your first time on Crowdcast, there's chat over there where you're welcome to talk to one another, and I'll keep an eye on it. Should you have questions for Elia, look right down at the bottom of your screen. There's an Ask a Question button down there. There's a highlighted 4 right next to that right now. If you go in there, you can submit your questions. It will add them to a queue, and we can pay attention to them. The best part about the Ask a Question box on Crowdcast, I love this feature. You can upvote questions that you find more relevant or important, so we can focus on the topics that mean the most to you. So even if you don't have a question, jump in there and see what questions have been asked, and feel free to upvote the ones that you'd like to hear us answer. Okay, well, while people are rolling in, Eli, why don't you give us some context, background on you and Infinity?
Happy to do so. So I started Infinity Softworks in 1997 when I was a senior in college. I ran Infinity Softworks full-time until last summer. In that time, Infinity was kind of 3 startups in one. The first startup was focused on financial software for handheld computers, Palm, Windows Mobile, Windows. The second generation of Infinity was focused on improving math education. And the third generation was on, what's known now as the no-code tools for mobile devices around calculation. After that, I was involved with another startup in data analytics for internal grows inside of buildings. I did that for a year and a half, and last summer I took a job running the engineering team for a startup within Nike, which has been an exciting and interesting experience. My first time working in the corporate world, so my first non-startup.
So what inspired you to start back in 1997? Like that wasn't, if I'm remembering back, because I think my first startup was like in 1995 or so. That wasn't, I think people need to understand that wasn't part of popular culture. Like there was no Shark Tank. You weren't reading about like unicorn companies. Like what inspired you to start that company?
I I like to say that in my family we didn't know any better. Came from a long line of self-employed people.
Uh-huh.
My grandparents were self-employed. My dad was self-employed. My uncles were all self-employed. When I was in college, I was I would have a business degree and a minor in computer science, but have been writing software since I was 13 years old.
Mhm.
So when I was in college, I was using a TI HP calculator for my business classes. And invariably, I'd punch some numbers into the fields incorrectly and get back a result. And because you could only see one number at a time, it would throw me off. And then I would miss a problem on a homework assignment, for instance.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I thought to myself, boy, it would make a lot of sense if I just married this with a spreadsheet and you could see all your data at the same time. As I was coming into my senior year of college, I actually have an accounting degree, and I spent 2 summers working in accounting and realized that that probably wasn't the place that I wanted to be long term. So
Mhm.
instead, thought, well, geez, I need some computer science experience to see if writing software would be something I'm interested in doing. So I went looking for a job, and nobody wanted to hire a college intern basically at that point in time. So I had a friend that was working for a publisher in Tigard that was taking Apple Newton software titles, shareware titles, and putting them in retail boxes and selling them in retail, which would sound unbelievably bizarre to anybody who's starting a company today. And they were looking for somebody to write some software for this new handheld computer called a Palm Pilot that had just come out a few months before. And I thought, this is interesting. A great opportunity to write this piece of calculator software that I wanted for my own purposes, and that's how my career started. I ended up
So
leaving.
go
I
ahead.
left the picture and after I graduated from college and started my own company and somehow kept it alive for 22 years.
Did you get swept up in the whole dot-com thing back in the days, or was that kind of something that was just happening elsewhere for you?
Well, it's a pretty funny thing. When I was deciding whether I wanted to go into when I was deciding what I wanted to do with computer science and whether I wanted to be in the computer industry, I basically figured out two things. One was I downloaded all the documentation and sorry to my old college professor, I printed it all on the school computer printers so I could take it home and read it. Just a few hundred pages, no big deal. And the other thing I bought was a book on writing software for Macintosh. I've been an Apple user since what year? 86 was when I got my first Mac and or Apple, and my dad had bought a Mac around that time as well. So I was really engrossed in that world. What you got to remember with handhelds in that era was that there were multiple millions of units sold. They were all aimed at the business user, and they were growing at 100% per year clip year over year. People felt like it was ubiquitous, but I think at its peak were like 15 or 20 million Palm Pilots had been sold. So it felt like I was really at the cutting edge of this next generation of technology. So while the internet was interesting, we also have to remember 98 was the year that Google launched for the first time.
Yep.
I remember using them when I was in college when that came out, before they'd even launched officially. So this was this was really in the Yahoo heyday, the eBay heyday of the internet. And it just didn't feel like a place where you could write software. It was a place where you could write websites. So I didn't think too seriously about web stuff until the early 2000s.
Okay. So that kind of carrying through, and for people, just for context, for people who weren't in the industry back then, it was a very kind of, the bubble we had been in most recently was a very long, protracted upward curve, and the dot-com days were very rapid. Yeah, no love for Lycos. I was going to say Alta Vista, which was my favorite, but yeah, Lycos. Do you remember your CompuServe handle? The period of time with which that growth happened made it like kind of ridiculous at that point in time. So and everybody was so kind of like had so much hubris about the potential of the internet that it wasn't imbued with much reality. It was just craziness. And so the crash was even harder on folks. And I wonder, Elia, did that have any impact on you? I mean, did it have a positive impact where people are like, whoa, maybe you're right. Maybe we should focus on making software instead of this internet thing? Or what happened to you next during the dot-com bust?
Well, it was actually a pretty interesting time period. So that was all bootstrapped. I got a small literal angel investor. I wrote a business plan and took it to my college management professor. My college management professor, I said, would you review this for me? I would like some input. And he asked me what funny little cigarettes I had been smoking to write such a horrible. And I still have it around here somewhere. I'm afraid to go back and look at it because it's probably horrible and academic in its construction. But I basically bootstrapped the business for 3 or 4 years at that point. Brought on people as I needed them and ran it by myself. I was also going to graduate school at the same time, just trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I was 23, 24 years old at that point in time. And there was an opportunity to bootstrap, and I saw all these companies around me that were getting funded, and my gut reaction was they were being funded in for these bizarre business plans that I just didn't understand. So as I was going through college, though, and the handheld market kept growing, I wasn't real sure of myself. And
Mhm.
I ended up getting involved with a handful of people and ended up deciding that we needed to go get funding, and that if we didn't go get funding to run this business, that we were going to get run over by somebody that did. So I always had incredibly good timing. I can't even say that with a straight face. I always had horrible timing. Way too early or way too late. And
Mhm.
it turned I put together a great small team of people to be thinking about what is calculation, what is analytics and data mean on a mobile device. And we put together a business plan that, frankly, at the time was probably a great business plan. And again, I would look back on now and think it was really silly. And we started to raise money. And then the stock market crashed like 1 month later.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
the timing was impeccable. But what I saw coming out of that was that all these companies were just dying. They just disappeared overnight. And all
Mhm.
these companies that I put in our competitive bucket had disappeared overnight. So we continued with the funding, but I guess this is lesson number one for how to survive a stock market crash, a business crash, a recession. Lesson number one here is focus on businesses where you can make a difference. And it was at that point where we started saying, okay, look, the sales have dropped off. We went from growing mobile devices 100% a year to shrinking 10 to 15% every year. So we started to ask ourselves, what did it mean to be a key partner to Palm or the Windows Mobile manufacturers? How could we be a key partner? What vertical markets could we be playing in where we have some expertise or ability where we could be a true partner to these people and actually make product sales happen? And that's when we started. We looked at our closest relationship was with Palm, so we looked very closely at that relationship, and they were focused on three markets, three markets that we were really interested in. One was what they called FIRE. It was finance, insurance, and real estate, and we had products in that space. So we built a product specifically for residential and commercial real estate and worked on partnerships in that space in the vertical market to see if we could build revenue in that. And we had some modest success, but nothing that was looking like a real breakout opportunity. We partnered with a gentleman out of Indiana who was a pharmacologist and built a medical
Mhm.
product, which was another
Yeah.
market that was very focused on vertically. And again, the same thing, too much risk, too much concern about how to sell into that market. Again, it was a nice little side business, but we didn't see how we could turn that into a mainline business. And then the third was education. And Palm had a lot of effort going in the education space. They were putting a lot of money behind it. They had actually hired Apple's education team that had worked on getting Apple series devices accepted into education in the early 90s. Excuse me. And they had a really strong team. We're putting a lot of money behind it. And we saw a real opportunity to basically reinvent how high school math was taught.
Hmm.
Sadly, here we are 20 years later, and the same devices that we used when I was in high school were still being used then in high school, which are still being used now in high school, the TI-84.
Mhm.
Those devices roughly cost what we could put a piece of software on a low-end Palm for. And we ended up finding partnerships in this space that were really strong. Professors that had helped get TI established, longtime marketing people in the industry, and basically started reinventing the business around that opportunity. It is the closest I came in my 22 years of running Infinity to having the big exit.
Okay.
And unfortunately, bad luck worked against us in that case. But anyway, it was an exciting time, but being able to focus on that vertical market really kind of saw us through that down period,
Mhm.
figure out where we could make a difference. that was a huge difference maker for us as a company and helped lead us through that.
That's awesome. And so you're kind of, the economy is starting to kind of recover. You're focused on this vertical, and then here comes the mortgage crisis. And how does that affect your business and the company?
So the education opportunity unfortunately died in 94. So we did that for, oh, I'm sorry, 2004.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, decades start to blend together after all these sadly. So in 2004, 2005, by 2006, that business was dead for us, unfortunately. Paul made a strategic decision to move away right at the time where we had gotten, this is a long story, but we had gotten acceptance from the College Board to be used on advanced placement exams, which was the gatekeeper for using our technology in schools. And unfortunately, at the same time that we were accepted, Palm let go their education team and felt the future was in smartphones, and which they were right, but there was also this incredible business for iPods that they were just completely ignoring, and they dropped on the floor and moved on. And along with it, our business was basically shot. So we tried to transition. I cut back on the team, tried to transition to focus on desktop, on a web-based solution in 2005 and 6, and just schools just weren't ready for that in that era. Again, here I am, probably a decade too early. And by the time 2007 came about, and then we went into the crash, again, I ended up, I almost had started looking, at that point, we had started looking at closing down the business and moving on to something else when the iPhone launched. And it was at that point in time that we were looking at the iPhone and going, holy smokes, we came so close with mobile, and this is clearly going to be the mobile thing. Do we pivot or do we walk away? And it just so happened at that point in time that I had a couple of my old investors that came to me and said, hey, we're interested in putting a little money behind you in a loan. This market is fascinating. If you're interested in giving it one more go in a bootstrap type approach, then we would, to get you off the ground, then we would be open to that as well. So we basically ended up with enough debt funding basically to help us through that first year. But because of the way the handheld market blew up in 2008, 9, 10, 11, we kind of got on the right wave at the same time, which again kind of gets back to the earlier point, which is kind of the same approach, which is how do we focus on a business where there is growth opportunity? I mean, we're going through a recession, but as our businesses go, there's still plenty of businesses that are growing like crazy. I heard the other day that Zoom now has more monthly active users than Twitter has, which is incredible if that's true. But talk about a business that was well positioned for this kind of a pandemic. So there are those opportunities. But it might just mean that as a company, in our situation, we just needed to retool and focus in on what we did best and try to grow the business out of that.
Yep, that makes sense. I think where our paths first crossed were when we were starting to kind of come out of the mortgage crisis. The mobile industry was starting to form in Portland, at least kind of collectively. It just wasn't a bunch of one-off. It was actually becoming a community. And you were one of the folks who was critical to kind of bringing that community together with an event called Mobile Portland. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that event and how that kind of helped and supported the community in that time of need.
Oh, that was such a unique opportunity and such a unique group of people. So Mobile Portland, Jason Grigsby at Cloud4 was actually the founder of Mobile Portland, along with Raven Zachary, who, his company actually became Walmart Labs after it was acquired. And did another incubator or contract development house. I actually don't know what to call what Raven's doing, but those were the ones who are behind the kind of the original impetus for Mobile Portland. But I got involved relatively early on. Jason had some ideas about how to grow it, and I agreed to come on and kind of help him grow and run it.
Mhm.
It was such an amazing group of people because this was such a tight-knit group of people all focused on the same opportunities in the mobile space where these folks really didn't have any sense of what mobile was all about. It's really easy now to look back on that time period and forget just how different developing for mobile was from everything done before. It really took a very different mentality to develop for mobile devices in that era, and a completely different way of even thinking about software. And this is true. I mean, go talk to people that have been doing web development for a long time, and they don't think about mobile the same way that we do. So that was kind of a catalyst for a whole group of people. We did monthly meetings. We rotated through topics, everything from deeply technical topics to what's the impact of mobile in the marketplace? How is this impacting different markets, different vertical markets? People talking about all kinds of topics related around mobile. And we did that for, boy, what was it? 8 years? 9 years?
Yeah, it was a while. Yeah. And it was always the, today I get the question, people are new to Portland or new to the startup community, and they're like, what's the one event I need to go to? And there isn't really a dominant or predominant event. But at that point in time, the first thing out of my mouth was always Mobile Portland, because it was not only the mixture of the community coming together, but the topics and the programming and the production values were bar none the best thing going at that point in time.
Yeah, we had some amazing people involved. There was Seth Shakira, I think is Seth's last name, was a videographer. So he was taking video, and we were posting that on YouTube for people, or whatever, Vimeo, I think, actually, for people to watch. It was pretty. It was just a great group of people, and it was amazing. Every month, about half the people would be brand new and had never been to an event before. Every single month for 7 years, it was such a great catalyst from a community perspective. That anyway, it was one of the shining things. I was so glad I was involved with it, and thank Jason for allowing me to be part of it.
Yeah, it really was an amazing event. You should be proud of that. So let's take us through to the kind of last iteration, the Power One era
Yeah.
of Infinity Softworks.
So that was a trickier time period. By this point, I was after my failings in trying to pivot in the education market to a web-based solution. I had been going through a period where I actually went and spent a lot of time with educators for many years, and spent time talking to them about the kind of solutions that they needed to better teach math ed. I was traveling all over the country for a while doing that kind of work. And what I was finding was these teachers were being like, hey, I would go to them and say, what if we did this? And they'd be like, oh, that would be fantastic. We should do this. And we were like, okay, good, let's go do this. And then we went off for a year and developed it. And then I went back to all my teachers and said, okay, we've got this great solution now. And the teachers were like, okay, that's great. And then they didn't use it. And I'm like, okay, what did I miss? What happened here? So this was the era, 2004, 2005, 2006, when we first started talking about what made startups successful. That had never been a topic before. Steve Blank had just written Four Steps to the Epiphany. What's his name? Did Lean Startup. So that community had just started getting formed around what makes software companies successful in startup environment, how they're really not small versions of big companies. They're something completely unique and different. And I kind of went off and started to study that and try to understand that for myself so I could do better with the next startup. I had no thought at all about really working for anybody else. I was clearly going to, and didn't matter. I didn't need money yet because I didn't have kids yet. So, well, I guess in '06 I had kids, but they were fine. So by the time the handheld thing came about and we raised a little bit of money, the question came for us, do we go raise a round of funding or do we bootstrap? My proclivity in general was to just kind of put my head down and go bootstrap it and figure out how to make it work. But again, this was an era where bootstrapping was really not a thing. We didn't talk about that in software. In '98, to give all of you a clue as to what I did in the late '90s, we actually set up phone systems so that people can call in and ask us questions. We had an 800 number. We'd pick up the phone. Even though there were only two of us, I would pick up the phone, and if somebody asked for me, I'd say, "Oh, please hold on." And I'd put myself on hold, and I'd walk away for a few minutes and then come back and say, "This is Elia," as if they had just transferred the phone call to me. I used my middle name for years and years to answer support so that people didn't realize that I was the one who was answering support questions. I still do to this day with support for Infinity. So bootstrapping, people didn't want to buy software from a bootstrap company. They thought that because you were funded and you were big, that you were more stable and therefore the software would be around. That was all disavowed, of course, with the dot-com crash. Right. So I kind of went through this period where I was partially bootstrapping and partially trying to figure out what the funding thing was. And I wasn't doing a very good job of focusing the business on fundraising. Again, I think what I saw in retrospect, what we know now for what we're doing with Infinity Softworks, it has a category and a title. Again, a case of me being way too early. Handhelds or mobile was taking off, smartphones were taking off, iPads were taking off, but this idea of being able to write software products where you didn't have to be a CS major in order to make a product for yourself was not a thing. The no-code movement wasn't a thing until really the last few years, handful of years. And so because of that, I think with the people that we went and talked to about the idea, either two things were occurring. One, I didn't have a really good way to talk about it. Or two, it looked like we were really slow. And investors don't want to invest in people that are really slow. But the reason we're really slow is because we're bootstrapped. And every time we turned around, we needed to figure out how to make enough money to keep running the business. And I think in retrospect, I would have been better off. What's the famous story of the Airbnb guy selling a special Cheerio Obama owed in order to cereal. Yeah, I think in retrospect, if I would have focused us on saying, okay, look, we've got 6 months worth of runway. We're going to build a quick prototype. We're going to take this to investors. We're going to see if they're interested for 6 months. And if it goes, it goes. And if it doesn't go, it doesn't go. In retrospect, probably would have better plan. But I tried to do them both at the same time. And I think they just played off each other. And by the time I got out the other end, 10 years goes by and you don't quite realize how much time you spent trying to bootstrap stuff and spent a lot of time writing contract software for other people to try to keep it going. And we made enough. After a while, we had made enough money for the couple of us that were really involved full-time day-to-day to really take one more swing at making Power One go into building the product out. We wrote a lot of code over a year or so, 2 years, released the product, and unfortunately, it just wasn't there. We weren't ever able to really figure out the marketing side of it, to be honest with you.
Yep.
I think the technology and the product is great. I don't think we ever figured out how to market and sell it. And I think, frankly, in my 22 years, the times when Infinity did well was when we figured out how to market and sell the product. And the time when it didn't do well was when we couldn't figure that out. And frankly, to this day, I think if at some point in my future, if I leave Nike, don't go to work for somebody else, but go back to running a startup or being involved in a startup. Even the last startup I was involved with the analytics company, I think if I was to have done that over again, we would have. I think the missing component in all of that was get the marketing lined up, get the sales lined up. The technology can take care of itself. The hard part for technologists in general is marketing and sales, and it's really easy to let the easy part, writing code, take over. It's comfortable. So I think if I would have done my job better, I think I would have focused all my attention on the marketing and sales, whether that was on fundraising or just from a bootstrap position, figuring out who was going to buy the product and actually pay good money to do it.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. And I can't imagine. So I've always been, when I was on the startup side, I was always in marketing. So like I was trying to figure out those things. Working with brilliant engineers who had built really great feature-rich products, but without the marketing effort, they weren't ever going to go anywhere. And I can't imagine how difficult it must be to be the hands-on person making the thing and have people not recognize the genius of the thing you're making. Like I can't imagine how hard that must be.
Well, that 10 years was worse in some way because we did just enough marketing to get just enough people to recognize it, that it was a thing. I mean, if you go back to 2011, 2012, we had 3 apps in the top 100, I think, 1,000, top 1,000, and one app in the 100 of all apps being distributed in the App Store at that point in time. So we had done enough to get just enough success to taste it, but not enough success to be sustainable. And I'll tell you, that's the worst place to be in from a company perspective, because it's impossible to know whether you should just keep pushing a little further or whether you're pushing on rope and it's just not going to go anywhere.
Yep. Well, I could sit here and reminisce with you for hours. We do it on a regular basis. But I would love to get to some of the questions from folks. So I'm going to jump in there. Again, if you have a question, feel free to add it down near the bottom at the Ask a Question tab. And even if you don't have a question, jump in there and upvote questions you'd like to see answered. The top question right now, Elia, is any advice for tech startups who are building a team right now? You touched on some of the business aspects, but what about the team dynamics?
Well, I'll say if you have the ability to pull people in, usually recessions are a great time to find amazing people. When times are good, we all want the last dollar. If you're good engineer in particular, jobs are easy. When times have been bad, I've managed to find incredibly good people that are willing to make a bet on a startup company for a while and get to the point where they can make more money working for your startup. That's always one way of thinking about this time period. It's been very enlightening and interesting now working for Nike and seeing how Nike approaches a recession. Nike views it as a way of separating itself from its competition, which is really a fascinating approach. While everybody else is retrenching, Nike goes into this total assault mode where we start thinking about what do we need to do to accelerate this business coming out of the recession. And usually, from what I understand from other people inside the company, since I wasn't here when we went through the last recession, is that we like come out of these things and like have jetpacks on our backs. Just things just start to fly. So I think that's another way to think about how to treat this recession. It's from a business perspective, it really is an opportunity in some ways to rethink your business, make it more resilient. It was for me. I always thought about both times I went through it. The thought was, how do we become more resilient? How do we build thing that customers are willing to pay for in a downtime? When what's the line? When the tide isn't rising all boats. when you're in that period where only the winners survive, it's a good opportunity to figure that out or to retrench for yourself and move on to something else. It's probably important to note for those that weren't around is that the Web 2.0 movement, all the companies that we look at today being the bellwether companies on the web, everybody from SurveyMonkey to MailChimp, boy, you name them. They all came out of that down era from 2001 to 2004. And they built Wikipedia. All those companies built incredible businesses during the downtime.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Next one. So during these points in time, obviously one of the unfortunate effects is that you have to either reduce headcount or you have to lay people off. Without using a euphemism, people lose their jobs. But I think the other part is it also can be difficult for people who keep their jobs in a down economy, and they're impacted as well. So how did you keep your team feeling secure and motivated during those challenging times? What did you do as a leader?
So this is one place where my accounting degree actually was a benefit. I was always very intimately involved with the financials of the company, what was going on. And because I was able to look ahead and see what was coming down the pike, I could make decisions very early on. So I think there were two things that helped. The first recession was probably the time when I had the biggest team around me. The second one, we had unfortunately pretty much already died off to the point where it was just a couple of us, so I didn't have to make cuts during that time period. But during that first time, I think there were two things. Excuse me a second. I don't have a mute button. I need a mute button. There were probably two things that I did that were beneficial in particular. One is that I made deeper cuts sooner than I would have otherwise. I think the worst thing in a recession is to play out the cuts. So if you're running a big enough company, man, just make the cuts and then take care of everybody else. This is, again, something amazing that Nike did. Literally the week they sent us home, everything paused. So they make sure that everybody that's working there is taken care of first and reassured them that you're being taken care of first. The second thing that I would recommend, if you have to make cuts, reinforce with your team that you're making the cuts, over communicate. And then the other thing is keep the team focused on the bigger vision. In the first one, it was crafting that vision for education. And the whole team was so excited about the mission of thinking about education and how we could reinvent math and how we'd have a generation of students that would understand the topic better than we had before us. Oh, well. But those were the things that, TI, man, you've let the country down. So those are a couple of things that I would focus on. Just three things, I guess. Over communicate. If you have to make cuts early, reinforce that you're taking care of everybody else, and then focus on that mission, on that vision, on the great things and why people wanted to work for this company to begin with.
That's great. Next question is, when did you know you had something? However you define that, whether it was revenue or market, did you ever have something? Was there an inflection point, or was it just a slow burn, or like maybe provide some more detail there? When you recognize these market opportunities, what was that spark?
Yeah, so let's focus on the education one, because that was the one where there was clearly a holy smokes moment.
Yep.
The other ones are much more difficult. I mean, the first one was when I ran the first generation of Infinity Softworks, the financial software stage. That was really having people just call in and order software. And every month our sales would grow. And seeing that sales grow month over month was so reassuring. Tony Robbins ordered software from us. I remember being put on hold by a secretary, and we were like, that was the most exciting thing in the world in 1997, by the way, for a couple of 23-year-olds. So the education one was different. There was clearly a desire by the market to use our product and our solution. I would see it in my customers' faces, is probably the best way to put it. I was going to a lot of trade shows at that point. I was doing 5 or 6 trade shows a year. And then I was also going to schools and districts, both on my own behalf and on the behest of Palm, to present how to use handhelds in math ed and in education as a whole. And you would actually see the teachers' faces light up when they would look at this product and how they would use it. I was at a math conference one winter, and I actually had a teacher walk up to me, a calculus teacher walk up to me and say, "Show me what you're doing." And I showed him what I was doing. And the teacher actually got tears in his eyes and said, "Oh my gosh, I could use this. My kids would actually understand calculus after all this time." So seeing the reaction from the customer was so reassuring, understanding that they really cared for, even though the sales were harder because of the way that the education market works. And getting the reaction we did, getting the reaction out of partners, getting the reaction from customers, getting reaction from people that wanted to advise us and help us build this business was very reassuring.
Cool. Thank you. I saw one flip. Okay. So going back to the business plan you presented to your professor, Ryan wants to know what was missing from that business plan, or what do you think makes a business plan compelling today for folks in that sort of situation?
I thought he was going to ask me if I was actually smoking funny little cigarettes. The answer was no, I actually wasn't smoking funny little cigarettes, which were not legal at the time.
Right. It was a different time.
Didn't stop anybody, but it wasn't legal. Let's see. If you haven't read it, Guy Kawasaki's book is a great book to read. Man, that's got to be 12, 13 years old now.
Yeah.
But the start, man, I almost had to turn around and look for it. You can see it on behind me there. It's I think the blue one with the orange, but that was a very important book to read because it really outlined what a business presentation should be all about. The long and the short of it is what I had written in 1997, 98 felt far more like an academic term paper than it felt like an actual business model. But it's important to understand that in that era, people were getting funding with business plans that read just like that. It wasn't that unusual. It was not that hard to get funding in that era. People were throwing money at you, people that had no idea what they were doing. People were investing in WorldCom and Enron for us old timers and losing all their money, who had no business being in the stock market at all. So at that era, it was very different in the way that you thought about and wrote a business model, business plan. Now, I think that's different. I think we need to be far more focused on competitive advantage, on the vision for the company, what you're doing that's different in the marketplace. I actually felt with the last startup we did in the analytics space, indoor grow analytics space, that we'd actually built a very good business plan and a very good business model. And it was just a weird time for us to try to get money to raise funding in that space. Obviously, one of our target customers were grows, cannabis grows. And it's restrictive on the kind of money you can raise to do that, because anybody that's funded from a federal source or a state force can't invest in that kind of business. So given that, I think that was a much better business model where we focused on how were we differentiated, how were we going to market and sell it, how do we go to market, how do we grow this business, how does it become something bigger than just a few guys playing around in a closet.
Next quest. Thank you. The next question, I'm really looking forward to the answer to this one. So you've developed on any number of platforms
Yeah,
now.
too many.
What is your favorite platform to develop apps for?
Today
Yeah.
or in all time?
Well, let's do both.
Okay. Um, I've enjoyed a few different platforms. So I really enjoyed writing for Palm in the
Mhm.
early. I will tell you, it was not for the faint of heart. Coming out of school and not having a lot of practical application, but getting more academic application, it was a very confusing platform to write for, and it took me a long time to figure out how to do it. But what I loved about writing software in that era was I literally knew the Palm language and all the APA calls frontwards and backwards to the point where I could literally sit down and start writing code and never have to look anything up.
Mm,
Keep in mind, this is all before Stack Overflow, so there was no
right.
to go look anything up anyway, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot easier today, folks. For those of you that do not remember Powell's Technical Bookstore, you have missed out. That was an amazing institution in its day.
Yeah.
Just the technical bookstore. Um, More modern times, I kind of vacillate between writing for iPhone and writing JavaScript. And the JavaScript one is probably going to surprise a lot of people because I think most people hate JavaScript. But the thing that I love about the iPhone is how much power is behind it. I don't write a ton of Android code. I have written Android apps, but I don't write a ton of Android
Mhm.
code on a regular basis. Um, so I believe Kotlin and Swift have basically kind of become very similar from what I've seen from my team's development efforts. But I always enjoyed writing for iPhone. I loved the fact that I could carry my work around in my pocket. I loved the power and the flexibility that it gave me. Um, that stuff was has always been amazing. There are other things about it that I find frustrating. The fact that it is constantly changing and evolving, that anything that you learned 3 years ago is pretty much gone now, and you have to start all over again. There's no longevity in the code that you're writing and the work that you're doing. JavaScript, in some ways, is the exact opposite of that. I mean, talk about a language where you can so easily kill yourself. It's complicated, it's confusing, its debuggers are half built, half implemented. But again, in some ways, the language is so easy. You take the basics of JavaScript, you couple that with even jQuery, and you can build these amazing interactive websites that anybody that literally you hit Command R on your keyboard and you can see in action as you're going. And there was something about the immediacy about that, for one,
Mm.
and the pace of evolution that allowed for a focus on product improvement and not on backfill and technical debt that I really did enjoy quite a bit writing JavaScript as well.
That's awesome. I don't know how closely you've been tracking this, so if you don't have an answer, feel free to say so. But one of the questions is, do you feel there is any tech that is standing out in the educational space now?
Mm. Um, well, I'm very closely informed of what's going on in education for a couple of reasons. One,
Mhm.
I have two daughters that are both in middle school, so watching them move into this work from home. They're both in public school. So
Mhm.
one's at a magnet school and one's at the neighborhood school. So it's been really interesting to watch those two schools handle independent of each other. But I also served as the technical advisor for their elementary school when they were there for 7 years. And that was pretty amazing transition time period. I helped move the PTO organization, parent teacher organization, from basically using almost no technology to being able to sell events, raise money, promote, make connections with the customer base all through their online presence. Helped move the entire school to what was really almost one-to-one computing, either iPads or Chromebooks. again, lucky that my kids went to a school that had a ton of parent support, some of the best parent support, probably the most parent support in the entire Beaverton school district. So pretty lucky there that I had a fairly large budget to work with, which over many years, plus Beaverton's investment in technology. So those were things that were really fascinating to me. And over the last kind of 8-10 years is this migration from no computing in the school to computing in the school. When I first started in math ed as a business, the teachers were really uncomfortable with technology as a whole. By the time I started helping my daughters in my daughter's school in math, in education and computing technology, the teachers were now comfortable, but they didn't really know how to utilize the technology across the classroom. As we saw going into this pandemic, if you read the newspapers, the articles are all, oh my gosh, my kids are on computers all day. Well, guess what, folks? We're all on computers all day, one way or the other. So I think what's happening right now, which is really fascinating to me, is now that the schools are basically being forced to say, how do we use technology effectively in order to teach classes because we have no other choice. I think what's going to be really interesting to watch is how does that filter back to the classroom when we all go back. Cross my fingers, hopefully this fall. So to me, that's kind of the near-term trend that I think is really compelling and interesting.
That's awesome.
In high school, still screwed because we're still using TI. So I'll just keep repeating that while we're here. So I'm going to take as many
This episode not sponsored by TI.
Not sponsored by Texas Instruments.
What you've touched on a few really insightful pieces of advice, but this one, just to kind of put a cap on it, what is your number one piece of advice for vendors trying to weather this pandemic right now?
Keep your head down. Keep focusing on your business. It's really easy to get caught up in everything that's going on around us, and things are going to happen. This is all out of our control. There was a great book in the late 90s. I think it was something along the lines of acknowledge the things that are outside of your control and focus on the things that are in. I completely butchered that, but it was something along those lines. And I think the same thing here. I've tried to reinforce that with my team at Nike over and over again. The things that are in our control are building software, shipping software, supporting the adapt shoes, making that whole project go. That's within our control. How long we work at home, how far we're separated from each other, when we go back to the office, who's sick, who isn't. Let's keep ourselves healthy. Let's keep acknowledging the fact that this is a stressful time emotionally for a lot of people, but we have a job to do. And sometimes it's easier to just bury your head in the work and plow ahead.
That's great advice. Thank you. Another one. So we've got about two more, and I think we can get both of them. I'm super early, and I'm having a difficulty doing customer acquisition during the COVID pandemic. Any advice in that regard?
That's a tough question. So customer acquisition is hard across the board when you're new.
Yep.
It's hard for me to speak to a specific case in this instance, since I don't know what the actual problem is. But if you're having problems with the approach that you're having in getting customer acquisition, might be worth taking a step back and just thinking about if there's a different approach to finding the right people to talk to. If at the end of the day you work through this and you're not able to get the recognition because of the product that you're working on, that it's just not critical enough in this time period, or you unfortunately made the next great restaurant reservation app, which would have been horrible timing. Might just be the wrong time to have that product, and it's worth putting on the back burner for the moment and coming back when things are a little better. But I
Yeah.
would suggest to fill this out a little more that might be worth taking a step back and trying to see whether there's a different approach to going after it. You disappeared on me there.
Oh, did I? I'm still here,
You're
hopefully.
just a pie logo now.
Yeah, well, I can still see me, so hopefully I'm still record. I mean, it could be better not seeing me altogether. I mean, that could actually be an improvement on the
I
live stream.
like to say I have a face made for radio, so.
Last question before I get back to you. Any suggestions for promoting an open source project these days?
I have no background or experience in that, I'm afraid. So
Okay,
I wouldn't even know where to begin guiding you in that regard.
that's totally fair. Thank you. We made it through all the questions. Thanks to the audience for making that. And then of course people have to submit joke questions, so we're not going to count those. But the
It is
this
though.
is the point in time where we like to kind of turn the tables on the guest and ask, how can we as a community be helpful to you? You're providing all this great advice for us. What can we be doing to help you right now?
Well, I don't really have anything in particular. I have a great love of helping startups. Always have. Don't always know how to apply that interest and that love, both from a mentoring and a startup perspective. But I'm gonna kind of turn this back around. But I'm available on Twitter if you want to reach out. If you need advice or input or help, I'd be happy to get on a call with you and lend some advice if anything I'm doing is applicable to your world.
Cool. Thank you so much, Elia. It was really great having you here. I love kind of, it's kind of are in sync and we can there in terms of what we experienced during the dot-com days and the mortgage crisis and the Portland startup community. It's been really, really good talking to you. Really appreciate your time. I kind of have started saying the only drawback of Crowdcast for me so far is that you can't hear the applause from the audience, but trust that people are applauding for you at home, and we really appreciate you making the time. Just to remind folks, we're trying to do these on a regular basis just so that the community feels some connection, gets to see some faces they might not get to see on a regular. And so coming up next week, if you'd like to join us, we have Shelley Bell of Black Girl Ventures joining us on Tuesday, I believe. Kate Ertman, who is here in Portland, still operations exec for startups, wicked smart and funny, and I would really appreciate you showing up for that one. And then for those of you who are asking marketing questions, this could be really valuable for you. Malia Spencer from the Portland Business Journal will be doing kind of an Ask Me Anything about how to talk to media. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. And as always, you can submit your questions ahead of time for those presentations. You don't even have to show up. We'll try and get your question answered. And then, as always, this session will be pretty much immediately available at this very same link. So if you want to come back and review stuff or review some of the other questions, you're more than welcome to do that. Again, thank you, Elia. Great to see you. Hang in there and have a good weekend, and we'll talk to everybody later.
Thanks, everybody.
See
Bye.
ya.